There are moments in life that seem far larger than the events themselves. A message arrives unexpectedly. A familiar name appears on a screen you have spent months trying not to look at. Perhaps there is no apology. Perhaps there is no explanation. Perhaps there are only a few simple words. Yet what follows inside you can feel disproportionate to what has actually happened. Your thoughts begin moving before you consciously decide to think. Old emotions rise with astonishing speed. Memories return carrying the same emotional weight they possessed months or even years ago. Suddenly, the person you believed you had left behind no longer feels distant at all. Most people assume that what disturbs them in such moments is the return of the other person. They believe the emotional intensity comes from the avoidant ex themselves. They imagine that the message, the call, the unexpected appearance has somehow created the reaction. Yet from a psychological perspective, this explanation is far too simple. Human beings are rarely moved so profoundly by events alone. What truly affects us is the meaning those events awaken within us. When an avoidant partner returns, people often experience a peculiar sensation that is difficult to describe. It is not merely hope, it is not merely excitement. It feels as though something unfinished has suddenly reopened. A chapter believed to be closed begins breathing again. Questions that had fallen silent start speaking once more. The mind immediately moves toward possibility. Perhaps they have changed. Perhaps they finally understand. Perhaps this time will be different. Before any evidence exists, before any meaningful conversation has taken place, the imagination begins constructing an entire future from a single moment of renewed contact. This phenomenon deserves careful examination because it reveals something essential about the nature of the psyche. The return itself is rarely the source of the disturbance. Rather, the return acts as a key inserted into a hidden lock. What opens is not necessarily the relationship. What opens is the unconscious. Many people spend months convincing themselves that they are healing, only to discover that healing and dormancy are not always the same thing. Something can remain dormant beneath the surface while appearing resolved. Then one small trigger can reactivate an entire psychological structure. Suddenly the longing returns, the confusion returns, the obsession returns, the desire to understand what happened returns. One brief message can seem capable of undoing months of emotional progress. Yet what has actually happened?
The
answer is often surprising. The avoidant has not returned as a solution. They have returned as a temptation. The temptation is not necessarily to reunite with them. The deeper temptation is psychological. It is the temptation to revisit a familiar emotional landscape. Human beings are drawn not only toward pleasure but also toward familiarity. We repeatedly return to experiences that feel psychologically known, even when those experiences have caused suffering. The psyche often prefers the familiar pain it understands to the unfamiliar freedom it does not yet trust. This is why so many people feel an immediate pull towards someone who once created profound confusion within them. The attraction is not always rooted in love. Sometimes it is rooted in unfinished psychological business. Something inside the individual believes there is still an answer waiting to be discovered. Something believes that if the right conversation occurs, if the right explanation is finally given, if the right emotional outcome is achieved, then the suffering of the past will suddenly acquire meaning. But this assumption contains a dangerous illusion. Meaning cannot always be recovered from the person who participated in the wound. Often the psyche creates a fantasy that healing will arrive through the very source of the original injury. It imagines that the one who created uncertainty will someday provide certainty. The one who withdrew will someday provide reassurance. The one who left will someday provide closure. Yet this expectation grants enormous psychological power to another human being. It places the key to one's emotional resolution in someone else's hands. The avoidant return becomes so emotionally overwhelming because it appears to offer access to this fantasy. For a brief moment, the mind whispers that everything unresolved may finally be resolved. The story may finally conclude. The questions may finally receive answers. The confusion may finally become clarity. Yet this is precisely why caution is necessary. The psyche is most vulnerable not when it is suffering, but when it believes salvation has appeared. The avoidant individual often returns carrying the same mystery they carried before. They may possess greater awareness. They may not. They may genuinely miss the relationship. They may simply miss the comfort of familiarity. The reality varies from person to person. Yet before any objective assessment can occur, the individual receiving the return is already engaged in a much deeper psychological encounter. The real encounter is not with the avoidant. It is with themselves. For what becomes activated in these moments is rarely just affection. It is longing, hope, projection, memory, fantasy, regret, possibility, grief, desire and fear all converging at once. The return functions almost like a psychological mirror. It reveals aspects of the self that have remained hidden beneath daily life. It exposes emotional attachments that were never fully examined. It illuminates hopes that continued surviving long after reason suggested they should disappear. This is why the return feels so powerful. The event itself may be small. The psychic meaning attached to it is enormous. What appears on the surface to be a simple message from an ex-partner is often something far more significant within the inner world. It becomes a confrontation with everything that relationship came to symbolize. The individual is no longer merely facing another person. They are facing their own expectations, their own wounds, their own fantasies, and their own unconscious desires. And it is here that the true psychological mystery begins. For the question is not whether the avoidant has come back. The question is why their return possesses such power over the inner life. Until that question is understood, the individual remains vulnerable to confusing emotional activation with destiny, longing with truth, and temptation with genuine transformation. If we are to understand why the return of the avoidant partner possesses such extraordinary power, we must go deeper than the relationship itself. We must descend beneath the memories, beneath the emotions, beneath the explanations that the conscious mind prefers to tell. For there is a tendency in human beings to believe that their suffering began when a particular person entered their life. We point to the relationship and say, that is where everything started. We point to the breakup and say, that is where everything went wrong. Yet again and again, psychological investigation reveals something more unsettling. The pattern is usually older than the person who appears to embody it. The avoidant did not create the entire story. They stepped into a story that was already waiting for them. Its realization is difficult because it removes us from the comforting simplicity of blame. It would be easier if the avoidant alone were responsible for the emotional grip they continue to hold. It would be easier if their inconsistency, distance, and unpredictability explained everything. Yet what makes certain relationships so psychologically consuming is not merely the behavior of the other person. It is the way that behavior connects with something hidden within ourselves. This hidden dimension is what Jung called the shadow. Many people misunderstand the shadow. They imagine it as a collection of dark impulses, forbidden desires, or negative traits they refuse to acknowledge. Certainly it can contain such elements, yet the shadow is broader than that. The shadow consists of everything that remains unconscious, everything we have not fully integrated into our understanding of ourselves. It includes wounds we have not examined, needs we have not accepted, fears we have not confronted, and longings we have disguised beneath more respectable explanations. The return of the avoidant often awakens this shadow because it activates precisely those hidden regions of the psyche. Consider how strange the situation truly is. Someone who repeatedly created uncertainty suddenly reappears, and instead of immediately evaluating them through the lens of their past behavior, many people feel an almost magnetic pull toward possibility. The mind becomes less interested in what actually happened, and more interested in what could happen. Reality begins surrendering ground to fantasy. The future becomes more compelling than the past.
Why?
Because the psyche is no longer responding to the person alone. It is responding to what that person symbolizes. The avoidant becomes a carrier of unconscious meaning. They become the embodiment of a hope that has existed long before them. They become the stage upon which an older drama attempts to replay itself once again. This is where we encounter one of the most important ideas in depth psychology: repetition compulsion. Human beings have a curious tendency to recreate unresolved emotional experiences. We do not merely remember the past, we unconsciously seek opportunities to relive it. Some hidden part of the psyche remains convinced that if the story can be repeated, under slightly different conditions, perhaps this time it will end differently. The child who never felt fully chosen may spend adulthood pursuing people whose affection remains uncertain. The person who grew up chasing emotional availability may find themselves repeatedly attracted to partners who are difficult to reach. The individual who experienced inconsistency early in life may come to associate uncertainty with emotional significance. None of this occurs consciously. No one wakes up and decides to pursue emotional unavailability. The pattern operates beneath awareness. This is why the avoidant relationship often feels so intense. Intensity is frequently mistaken for compatibility. Emotional activation is mistaken for profound connection. Yet what many individuals call chemistry is sometimes the collision between present circumstances and ancient wounds. The avoidant's distance creates longing. Their inconsistency creates anticipation. Their withdrawal creates pursuit. Their return creates hope.
The entire cycle begins generating enormous psychological energy.
And because that energy feels powerful, people assume it must be meaningful. Yet intensity and meaning are not the same thing.
The storm is intense.
That does not mean it knows where it is going. The tragedy is that many individuals spend years studying the avoidant while remaining strangers to the pattern operating inside themselves. They analyze every message. They dissect every behavior. They attempt to decode every withdrawal and every return. Yet the most important question remains untouched. Why does emotional unavailability feel so compelling? Why does certainty sometimes feel less exciting than ambiguity? Why does the unavailable person occupy more psychic space than the available one? These questions point toward the shadow because they reveal preferences we do not fully understand. The unconscious often disguises old wounds as attraction. What appears to be love may partly be familiarity. What appears to be destiny may partly be repetition. What appears to be a unique connection may partly be an ancient psychological pattern searching for another opportunity to complete itself. The avoidant therefore becomes less of an enemy and more of a mirror. This does not excuse harmful behavior. It does not minimize the pain they may have caused. Rather, it reveals why their impact extends far beyond ordinary disappointment. They have touched something deeper than the relationship itself. The dam experience their hayatupjukti. This is why their return feels so dangerous and so seductive at the same time. It appears to offer a second chance, but beneath that hope lies something far more powerful: the possibility of finally resolving an old internal conflict. Yet the unconscious rarely resolves itself through repetition alone. Repeating the pattern is not the same as transcending it. One can revisit the same emotional landscape 100 times without becoming free of it. In fact, repetition often strengthens the very structure it seeks to heal. The individual becomes trapped in an endless cycle of anticipation, disappointment, hope, confusion, reunion, and loss. Each return feels like progress. Each ending feels temporary. Each beginning feels different. Yet beneath the changing circumstances, the psychological pattern remains remarkably stable. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. The greatest obstacle may not be the avoidant's inability to remain close. It may be our inability to recognize the hidden attraction we feel toward what remains unavailable. For as long as the unconscious remains unseen, it continues directing our choices from the shadows. The avoidant returns. The emotions return. The hope returns. And the old pattern quietly resumes its seat at the center of the stage. The crucial question, therefore, is no longer whether the avoidant has changed. The more important question is whether you have become conscious of the pattern that existed before they ever appeared. For if that pattern remains untouched, then every return risks becoming another chapter in the same story, regardless of how different the circumstances appear on the surface. And this is where the true test begins. For eventually, Every individual standing before a returning avoidant must confront a question that no analysis of the other person can answer. The question is not whether they miss you. It is not whether they have grown. It is not whether they finally understand what they lost. The question is whether you are encountering them as the person you are today, or as the person you were when the wound was first created. At first, this distinction seems subtle, but it changes everything. When the avoidant returns, two voices often emerge within the psyche. One voice belongs to the present. It observes reality. It asks difficult questions. It seeks evidence rather than promises. It is capable of patience and discernment. The other voice belongs to something much older. It carries longing, unfinished hopes, and ancient emotional expectations. It wants immediate relief. It wants certainty. It wants the story to conclude in a way that finally justifies the suffering that preceded it. The conflict between these voices creates the inner tension so many people experience. Part of them wants to move carefully. Another part wants to believe. Part of them remembers the pain. Another part remembers only the possibility. This is why the return feels like a crossroads. Not because the avoidant has suddenly become the central figure in the story again, but because their presence forces a confrontation between the conscious self and the unconscious pattern. You begin asking questions that have little to do with them and everything to do with you. Am I drawn to who this person actually is, or to who I hope they might become? Am I responding to reality, or to the fantasy that has accompanied this relationship from the beginning? Do I genuinely trust what is in front of me, or am I trying to rescue an old dream from its collapse? These questions can feel uncomfortable because they remove attention from the avoidant and return it to the self. Yet this shift is precisely where transformation begins. For the first time, the relationship is no longer being examined as a mystery to solve. Instead, it becomes a mirror through which deeper truths can be seen. You begin recognizing that your worth was never dependent upon their ability to stay. You begin recognizing that closure was never hidden inside their explanations. You begin recognizing that healing cannot be outsourced to the person who originally activated the wound. And as these realizations deepen, something remarkable happens. The avoidant gradually loses their position as the central character in the drama, not because you stop caring, not because you become cold, but because you become conscious. And consciousness changes everything. Eventually, a moment arrives that has very little to do with the avoidant and everything to do with you. It is not the moment they return. It is not the moment they apologize. It is not even the moment they finally reveal what they feel. It is the moment you begin to see that their return is only an event, while the pattern it awakens is the real story. For a long time, you believed the unfinished feeling belonged to the relationship. Now you begin to suspect that what remained unfinished was something within yourself. This realization can feel strangely liberating and strangely unsettling at the same time. The psyche often prefers dramatic answers because they allow us to keep searching outside ourselves. Yet individuation asks for something more difficult. It asks us to withdraw the projections we have placed upon other people and reclaim the parts of ourselves we hoped they would complete. The avoidant no longer appears as the keeper of your future, your healing, or your worth. They become what they always were. A human being who happened to activate a deeper process within your own soul. And perhaps that is the final transformation. Not that they come back, not that they leave, but that for the first time neither movement possesses the power to determine who you are,